Welcome everyone to the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum. My name is Craig Wright. I'm the supervisory archivist here, and I hope you're all enjoying the tantalizing possibility that spring may have finally sprung. First, I have a few announcements. I certainly encourage everyone to visit our exhibit, Tall Grass to Knee High, A Century of Iowa Farming. The exhibit is sponsored by the Iowa Farm Bureau Federation with support from the Hoover Presidential Foundation. It looks at the changes over the last 100 years to that Iowa economic icon, the family farm. We are very pleased today to have as our speaker Tim Niess, the Field Service Manager for the Iowa Farm Bureau Federation. He is responsible for recruiting, supervising, and training the 17-member regional staff, helping them to carry out program activities, organize and assist with the annual membership program, and supervise the operation of the County Farm Bureau offices in their region. Previously, Niess served as Executive Director for the Coalition to Support Iowa's Farmers and as a Regional Manager for the Iowa Farm Bureau Federation. He holds a BA in Business Management and Entrepreneurship from Buena Vista College. Tim and his wife, Jane, live in Des Moines, and they own and operate the 1900 Inn, a bed and breakfast. His talk today is entitled, The Inevitable Farm Bureau Movement and Iowa's Role. Please give a warm welcome to Tim Niess.
Thank you, Craig.
You're very welcome.
So it's a pleasure to be here. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself so you can kind of understand the context of where I come from. I was born and raised on a farm in northern Iowa, about 5 miles east of the town of Osage, about 14 miles from the Minnesota border, or up there in Minnesota there, we commonly refer to it. And we had a diversified livestock farm. We had cattle and hogs and dairy, and but most importantly, we were a Farm Bureau family. And my parents, my grandparents were all active in Farm Bureau. And so I grew up with that knowledge of Farm Bureau is important. And Farm Bureau is about a sense of community and a sense of service. And that had a great impression on me, I guess, as a young man. And when the opportunity came for me 24 years ago to come to work for the Iowa Farm Bureau, and particularly working in the area of field service, where you're working directly with the farmers and their families, that was a dream come true for me. And 24 years later, it's still a dream come true. And I'm one of those, I think, very lucky people who absolutely love their job. I love everything about it, and constantly I push myself to give back to it. So that's where I come from, and why I think the topic of this talk today is so important, at least to me, why it matters to me, is the inevitability of the Farm Bureau movement. I had never really thought of it in that context of being inevitable, and what makes it inevitable. In some of the research that I've done for Farm Bureau, for our centennial, this year is our centennial, I came across an article that was written for the 10th anniversary in 1928. And it was an article that was written by Dr. Taylor, who would have been like the dean of the Agricultural College at North Carolina State in 1928. And he's originally from Wright County, Iowa. So he had an Iowa tie. And in this article, he talked about the agricultural movement, the farmers' movement, as being something that you couldn't have stopped it if you tried. It was inevitable. And then went on to explain why it was inevitable. And I think to understand that, you have to have an appreciation for the unique opportunity that agriculture is in the United States of America. So we got to go way back to the early 1700s when those first farm families were immigrating to what was then a British colony. And who were they? Well, they were the farming middle class of England and Europe. They weren't necessarily landowners, which was why they were coming to America, because they were getting land grants, that if you would come, the king would grant you some land and then you could sort of begin your own farming operation there. But they were actual farmers. The United States of America, and I want this to sink in, the United States of America is the first civilized country to look at farmers as something more than peasants. It's true. The nature of agriculture in Europe, in England, Russia, was that you had your landowners, and they were landowners for centuries upon centuries, but they didn't do the work. They weren't the ones up at 5 o'clock milking the cows and all of that. They had people who they either were forced to work on those farms or they rented. And by renting, they were probably sharecrops, that you provided food to that squire, to the landowner, and that's how you got to farm. So the actual practice of farming was done by the lowest class of human beings in their social system. That's not the way that it was in America, because we already started with, it was probably the cream of that crop, who probably did better than most in being able to produce more. I think they had a better understanding of animal husbandry and agronomy, such as it was at that point. And that's where we began. So we began so far ahead of other countries in that it's really important to understand that. Our first presidents, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, they all owned farmland. They all actually worked farms. And now, granted, they didn't do all the work themselves or anything like that. I don't want to make that impression, but they did some. They knew what it was, and they supervised it. In Washington's first term, he tried putting together the first agricultural association, because one of the things he understood was that there's a certain amount of knowledge about farming, and it was in the minds of a very small percentage of the population. And if you were going to grow that, if you were going to improve agriculture, that knowledge had to be disseminated somehow. And an association, an organization was probably the best way of doing that. So the founders of our country already had that in their mind. They already had a great appreciation for agriculture. So now we fast forward to the Industrial Revolution, which probably one of the most important pieces of the Industrial Revolution was that you could now cast iron. You could make molds that you could cast iron, and it would make the same piece over and over and over again, and it would be identical, and you could do it many, many times, and it made tools and implements that people started to understand this is a good way of improving things. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that we got the first technological improvements in agriculture in probably 4,000 years. And that's kind of hard to get your mind around, in that agriculture just sort of existed as you make a hole in the ground, you drop a seed in it, maybe you drop a fish in there if you're lucky, and you know, things grow and you pick it and you start all over again. You keep some of that seed aside so you can replant it later, and that was about the extent of what agriculture was. So now that vaulted productivity, because we had better implements, we had better ways of doing production. It was easier, but it was better. And production started to increase rapidly at that point. So now we're past the Industrial Revolution, and then we get to just the very beginning of the 20th century, the early 1900s. And farmers are more productive. They have created more wealth. They are actually influential families in their communities. They're families that are looked up to. And they have begun to make that switch from where you grew what you needed to feed your family, to feed the livestock, to feed the horses that pulled those, even those new implements, they were pulled by horses. You were growing your own fuel, and in some cases growing your own fiber, you know, for clothes and things like that as well. And it was just beginning to move where we were being able to utilize steam power by utilizing coal. So there were other, I would say, better fuels. They were more efficient. Coal, for one, wood as another. That now we've got this centralized machine that can do the work of 20 men, and in a much faster way, because timing is everything in farming. You know, you've got so much time to harvest that crop and to take care of it so that it doesn't spoil. So now they're able to grow more crop. Now they've got extra crop that they can actually sell for cash. Now we got to have better roads. You know, it's that the one thing leads to the next, and now we need to be able to get that crop to the market faster and more efficiently, and so we needed to create better infrastructure in all of that. Along those lines, politically, there began trade unions. You know, you started to see more labor unions were being formed. So that whole idea of an organized group that represented your industry or represented your labor, what you do, was really starting to grow rapidly as well. And farmers are very good at organizing things. It's one of the pleasures I know in working in Farm Bureau when you're working with a group of farmers is once you get them organized, you get the heck out of the way because things are going to happen. They're very, very good at organizing. So it was a natural thing that they would do that. And I guess if you think back hundreds and hundreds of years ago back in Europe, that was already very much a part of their social structure, were the guilds that represented each individual profession, but they were thought of as a profession. Farming was beginning to become a profession at the very beginning of the 20th century, and part of that came about because of the United States government was, again, the very first government in the history of the world to publicly fund schools of agriculture, the Smith-Lever Act. And I can't quote you exactly what year that was passed, but it was in the late 1800s, which that gave us schools like Iowa State, Michigan State, Ohio State. Those state colleges were all agricultural colleges. And so for the first time in the history of the world, the common man, the common child could actually go to school and learn about agriculture. Again, that sort of that idea of George Washington's that we need to disseminate that information. So you have the first generation of those graduates from those state schools that are now finding professions within agriculture, and not just as producers of it, but those that helped, those who taught. And it's starting to create other, as innovation does, it creates other ancillary jobs. And so the movement that was happening at that point was, again, farmers feeling that need to organize, feeling the need that they, as voters too, that they were a voting bloc that needed to be recognized, and that they needed a voice in this. One of the first farm organizations that came along at that time was called the Grange. And it was extremely popular in the very beginning. A populist philosophy, I would say, and it was, so it's, you know, the farmers versus everybody else. And we need to get together and we need to help them understand what our needs are, and so that, you know, we have this voice. And they had a very charismatic leader in the beginning. And unfortunately, what happens with organizations where it's the foundation is primarily on either the characteristics of its leader or of the issue that it represents. As soon as the leader is gone or the issue is resolved, then the organization tanks, because, like, okay, mission accomplished, we're on to other things. And that's what happened with the Grange. They had a meteoric rise where they had over 1 million members across the country in a very short amount of time. But it went down just as fast. The Iowa Farmers Union started in 1915, and they came along about the same time as the Nonpartisan League. And the Nonpartisan League was starting to take hold in Iowa, and their whole idea was, we're not going to be a political party, we're not going to be aligned with any political party, thereby the Nonpartisan League. But we want to get our ideas out there. And so that was moving along. It didn't get a lot of traction because I think they spent more time explaining what nonpartisan league meant than really what the issues were. So I'm going to venture into, this is where Iowans became really important in this movement. The first one was James Wilson, otherwise known as Tama Jim. James Wilson was Secretary of Agriculture for 4 consecutive presidents. He served for 16 years as Secretary of Agriculture of this country, the longest serving Secretary of Agriculture in history. But when Theodore Roosevelt became president after McKinley's assassination, Roosevelt ordered a study to be done about rural America. Roosevelt was the first president who had actually traveled enough prior to being president that he understood what rural America was. He'd actually seen it. He'd lived in it. And he had a concern, that same concern of George Washington's, that are we helping rural Americans get the information that they need and the education that they need to have a higher quality of life? So they did that study in I believe it was 1902, and he made that, he took that to James Wilson, to his Secretary of Agriculture, and said, I want you to do this study, because you come from Iowa, you know better than anybody even how to go about doing this, so you organize it and you know, report back on your findings. So right from the very beginning, that whole idea about enhancing education came about from an Iowan. And And the report came back and said, yeah, there is a need. You know, that population is growing. We're getting there's a lot of people that are could be impacted by this. And the state colleges are not enough. Not everybody's going to go to the state college. So we have to find a way of getting that information and disseminating it to rural Iowans. We can't. They're not going to go to the college, so we got to get that information to them. So let's extend that information to these families. So that became extension. That's where the extension program was born from. We're going to extend that knowledge to the farmers. Now, how do we do that? How do we begin that? And I said, well, let's start in Iowa. That's about the best place to do this. And so there was a gentleman by the name of R.K. Bliss, who was he was on staff at the college, at Iowa State College, and it became his job to figure out how do you create an extension service. And long about that time, the Farm Bureau movement, it had begun in Broome County, New York, and it had become they sort of started that model already as by townships. You'd have farmers that would meet in another farmer's home in the township, and we'd just talk about things. They'd share the information they had. But it was family to family, and it wasn't really organized yet, but they started that concept of let's work in the area of a township. And so in 1912, Clinton County, Iowa, was the first county that started to organize that way. And it wasn't long before companies like Sears and Roebuck and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce began to understand that, well, hey, if these farmers are getting together and they're learning more about better production and they might need better tools and things, hey, we sell tools, so it would be in our best interest to help this. And so those early counties that organized actually got a grant of about $1,500, which is a lot of money back in 1912, to help them organize. And that grant was good for 3 years. But in order to get that grant, you had to have, at a minimum, 200 farmers in that county had to pay $5 and agree to pay $5 a year. And $5 was a lot of money back then as well, to be a part of this. And so they kind of matched the funding. Now, if you could get the 200 farmers and the $5 each, then you could qualify to hire a county agent. And in Clinton County, the gentleman who really spearheaded all of that was a man by the name of John Coverdale. John was a farmer. He and his brother farmed in Clinton County. But he was a good organizer, and he wasn't afraid to go out and talk to people. And farmer to farmer, here's what we're going to do. So R.K. Bliss finds out about this, and he meets John Coverdale and says, I want to hire you. I want you to be the guy that I rely upon to go from county to county and help these counties organize, get them to the point where they can hire a county agent and qualify for those grants, and then we'll do our best to keep them organized so that we can build from there. And John thought about that for a while, and then he decided, you know what, I think I'm going to enjoy that. And so he rented out his farm, and he went to work for R.K. Bliss. And again, this is right around 1912. So there were other states that were going through this same process. They were all learning pretty quickly, here's how you do this. And you know, that's the other thing. With farmers, once they figure out how to do something, they like to talk about it. And the news spreads really fast. And it kind of goes across the country that way. We started to see, particularly in the Midwest, Missouri, Nebraska, Illinois was also one of the leaders, Indiana, Michigan, Iowa, obviously, Minnesota. They all started pooling their knowledge, their ways that they could help get things organized, what was working, what was successful, and then, you know, share that as well. And so from that, the state, and particularly in the state of Iowa, it happened very quickly. Because it was proving to be not only as an organization was it successful in that they could get people to join and all that, but the educational aspect of this, what they were bringing, was of great value. It was said that you could easily, each farmer could easily make 10 times their dues, what they paid in dues at $5. They could increase their production and their income more than 10 times that with the information that they were bringing back from those meetings. And so that it became a pretty easy sell for them. So the next thing that comes along here that sort of was I would say the icing on the cake to really making the whole idea of organizing as a farm organization was World War I. When World War I broke out, the German army crashed through Belgium. And one of the very first things they did was to destroy as many of their windmills as possible, because they wanted to eliminate their ability to create food, to make flour. And I have a cousin in Belgium that went back to visit a couple of years ago, and one of his passions is rebuilding those windmills. He said it's like we're bringing it back, and there's a group of men, they're all, I think he's probably the youngest, and I think he's 72. So they don't work really fast, but they're very passionate about what they do. And but it's a very important thing to them, because they want to be able to say that we got that back, you know, we rebuilt it. So Belgium is a fairly small country, and it put them in a crisis, because they couldn't grind flour, they couldn't make bread, they were quickly starving. And President Wilson saw this and knew that we were really, we need to do something. The United States needs to do something. And so he reached out to Herbert Hoover, who was a young, very wealthy, successful miner. And that's putting it in very narrow terms, but he'd made a lot of money in mining. He had a tie to Iowa, because they knew that if we're going to raise food, we're going to do it in the Midwest, so we need a tie to Iowa as well. And so as Hoover organized his relief mission, and you can see all about that in the permanent display here, and please do that, because it's such an incredible story. But he reached out to the farmers, and because he knew he had to have some way, again, of disseminating that message that you can save these people. You will save these children from starving. But we need you to do it. We need you to commit to overproduce pork, overproduce wheat, corn, barley, so that we can use those grains, the excess, ship it over there and feed these starving people. And but you just don't start talking to farmers across the country. And he was getting frustrated in, where does my message go? How do I know who to talk to here? And yeah, there's some people say they represent the farmers, but I tried them and that didn't work. And he very famously expressed his frustration one day and said, "And who the hell speaks for the farmers anyway?" And the answer to that was Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau movement was beginning to really take on then. It was actually pretty strong by then. But as most movements go, it takes that fast start and then it kind of stops. It kind of gets stalemated there for a bit. And when Hoover came along and said, "Okay, I want to use Farm Bureau to do this, and I want to engage those farmers through Farm Bureau," his message was, we can win the war with food, and it's your patriotic duty to do this. And they believed that because Hoover himself wasn't taking a salary for this. And he got these wonderful, energetic young guys to work with him, these graduates from Stanford and other places. You can be a part of this as well, but you can't take a salary. You've got to do this because you're a patriot, because you believe in humanity. You can get your expenses covered, but you will not take a salary. None of us will. So he came with that credibility and encouraged farmers to overproduce, got the U.S. government to guarantee them a price to overproduce so that this excess could be shipped over there. And Iowans are nothing if not patriotic. I mean, that our love of country runs very deep and very dear. And so he started making this appeal in Iowa in early 1917, 1916, something like that. And by the end of 1917, with that patriotic push, all 99 counties in Iowa had established a county farm bureau. One was so patriotic it made two. In West Potawatomi, or in Potawatomi County, there are two county farm bureaus. There's an East Potawatomi and West Potawatomi. I don't know why they never just made that two counties, because they act like two counties in most respects. But anyway, but it gave us 100 county farm bureaus. And with that, then other states around us had already begun the act of federating, which means you would create a federation of these county farm bureaus. And it's really important to understand every county farm bureau is an organization unto itself. It has its own bylaws, its own articles of incorporation. They are a separate and unique organization. When you federate, so when the Iowa Farm Bureau Federation came about in 1918, they created an organization that has only 100 members. There are only 100 members of the Iowa Farm Bureau, and it's each county farm bureau. It's an important distinction to understand. So there was a young man from Marshall County. His name was James Rayleigh Howard. He was a mathematics professor and could have gone on to a great career as a mathematics professor, but he wanted to farm, and his family farmed near Clemens in Marshall County, and he left his teaching position to come back home and farm. He was a very intelligent young man, very passionate about farming. But he also understood that this is a profession, and we need to act like professionals, and we need to, if we're going to demand respect, we need to be respectful. We need to act like professionals. And that was very important to him. And he was also very good friends with John Coverdale. And they've been talking about federating, they've been talking about creating an Iowa Farm Bureau Federation for a couple of years. And after the large patriotic swing in 1917 got us there, they decided, and they being county presidents from different county farm bureaus that would get together, usually at the Iowa State Fair, because there was no Iowa Farm Bureau Federation, there wasn't a place specifically for them to meet. So the Iowa State Fair is really where a lot of their early Farm Bureau work got done, as far as when the counties came together, when those leaders came together. And they decided it's time to do this. That was in the summer of 2018. And they created a committee of about 5 county presidents, along with R.K. Bliss and John Coverdale. And decided in December of 2018, that's when they were going to have the large meeting and they would vote to start the Federation. So, being that Des Moines was the capital, that's where they wanted to hold the meeting. Well, there was another thing happening in 1918, and it was the Spanish flu. And Des Moines was having an outbreak, and it was just too dangerous to bring all those people in, to get into a closed room, and with the possibility of exposing them to the flu, which is obviously very deadly. So they were going to go to Ames, more central. Iowa State College is there, and but the outbreak had already moved to Ames, and so James Howard said, "Well, let's move it to Marshalltown. Let's have it there. It's almost as central, and we can use the courthouse. We can meet in the courthouse." So that's where they met. On December 27th in 1918, 77 counties were represented there, plus some other individual leaders that came. There was about 120, 130 people that showed up. And over 2 days, they called it their Constitution. It was their bylaws. They wrote their Articles of Incorporation. They wrote a mission statement. They wrote what their structure of offices was going to be, how they were going to elect their offices, how they were going to elect their district representatives, and then also go through, these are our priority issues that we're going to deal with. They did that all in 2 days. We couldn't get anything like that done today. It would take 2 years to do something like that. So it's really incredible. But it tells you that they came prepared. They were organized and they came prepared. So John Coverdale wrote the Articles of Incorporation and the bylaws. And for the most part, most of those are still intact today. And so you've got this patriotic fervor that is really starting to push things along. And Iowa is the very first state to federate with every county being organized and every county having hired an agent. Now the agent was also a part-time employee to the USDA. And they had to do an annual report to the United States Department of Agriculture. And we still have a few of those reports from the early 1920s. And these people who served as agents were about as patriotic and committed people as you'd ever want to meet. The way that they wrote is so eloquent, and their passion for this is really quite something. So we federate in 1918, and things are really going off well. But we need money. We've got to figure out how we're gonna make this thing work. And so they said, well, let's take up a collection. Let's ask farmers to give us some seed money to start so we can get going. And they collected $350,000 as a way of getting them started. Now you think what $350,000 would translate back to in today's money. I'm guessing it'd be a little over $3 million, probably, if you were going to adjust it for inflation. And that got them through to about 1935. So it was just really something for the farmers to. It showed their commitment as well, a financial commitment. That was going so fast, and then other states around were doing that as well. And said, hey, we're going to need a national organization too that can represent us in Washington, D.C. and sort of recreate this, but do it on a national stage. And so so James Howard gets elected as our first Iowa Farm Bureau president. And he's on the committee to talk about an American Farm Bureau. He is the president from Ohio, the Ohio Farm Bureau. His name was Oscar Bradfoot. New York Farm Bureau, the Illinois Farm Bureau, and John Coverdale. So they meet in Ithaca, New York, and start talking about, okay, let's think about how we would structure this for a national organization. So you've got two major Iowans already on this steering committee of Howard and Coverdale. And they're sizing everybody up as to how much help are they going to be, what can we rely on them to do, and things like that. And so because of their success in membership work, Howard and Coverdale get assigned to the committees of working membership, of how we're going to make this membership piece work. And the education thing, because Coverdale was working for Iowa State College. He'd helped create extension, so he had a really good knowledge of how you make that education piece work. And they decided they were going to meet. Then they would have a national meeting at the LaSalle Hotel in Chicago, a nice central place for the state Farm Bureau presidents to come and talk about federating into an American Farm Bureau. And that was in 1919, so just that following year. Oscar Bradfoot, who was the Ohio president, was given the task of writing their bylaws, of writing their constitutions, again, as they called it. That was strategic. Howard and Coverdale nominated him for that for one reason. He was a procrastinator. And they knew that he probably wouldn't get it done. And Coverdale basically took the Iowa bylaws and the Iowa's constitution, which he patterned after the Marshall County that James Howard had written, and just sort of had them in his coat pocket. And when they got to their organizational meeting and everybody looked at Oscar Bradfoot and said, well, Oscar, what have you got for us? And, well, I had every intention of getting these things written, but if you can give me a few days, I think I can come up with it. And Coverdale said, that's no problem. We can just use these. And so the American Farm Bureau basically mirrored the Iowa Farm Bureau with a very strategic move by understanding that a procrastinator is always going to be a procrastinator. So they have the big meeting at the LaSalle in Chicago, and because James Howard is one of the key people on the committee, he gave one of the keynote addresses. And in that address, he talked about what he thought the American Farm Bureau, how it should work. Because at that point, they had not decided yet if was the American Farm Bureau just going to be one organization, or would we, because farming is so different across the country, would we have an eastern division and a western division, or a northern division and a southern division? Because certainly what's good for one may not necessarily be good for the other. And so rather than having them competing interests, let's everybody kind of fight for your own region. And Howard was very much against that, because he said, then what's the point? Why have a national organization if all you're going to do is split into regions and fight each other? That's not going to help. And he said, and guys, it's no different than in our own states. Think of the difference in agriculture in your own state. And yet we came together as one organization to talk about agriculture as an industry in broad terms, that what's good for one is good for all. You know, that you don't get so far down into the weeds on things that you're supporting one commodity over another or one type of farming over another. That the Farm Bureau, if it's going to be successful, it has to start creating policy and supporting policy that is it's a very broad umbrella. It's not something that just fits regionally. And that philosophy won the day. And Howard ended his speech with a quote that said, "I stand as a rock against radicalism." It was also something that they were very concerned about, was this Farm Bureau movement was not about inciting violence or protests or things like that. He said, "I stand as a rock against radicalism, but I believe in an organization that should strike from the shoulder. That if we're going to make a point, let's make a point, and let's stand by that point." And his speech was done, his thunderous applause. He went back to his hotel, and he started packing his suitcase because he needed to get home. He needed to get back to Marshalltown, so because they were in the midst of picking corn, and they were picking corn by hand back then. There were really no machines for it, and he was getting ready to head out the door, and John Coverdale comes running into his room and says, "Hey, whoa, wait, you just got elected president of the American Farm Bureau." He said, "What?" I said, "Yes, unpack your bags, get back down there, because we got to get rolling." And that's how Howard became president of the American Farm Bureau. And afterwards, they were talking with people about, who'd you vote for and why and all that. And this one lady who was there that had voted, and she was representing her county, or her state, and she said, "I didn't know, he looked more like a farmer than anybody else there." The rest of them all looked like slick businessmen. He looked and sounded like a real farmer. So, oh yeah, there were women there, Shirley. Of course there were women there. So, the American Farm Bureau came into existence, and they started working. And Hoover was still, the Belgian relief effort was still in force, and so he went to New York to meet with Herbert Hoover to talk about how the American Farm Bureau could help out in this. And he took the train into New York. He got this about 6 o'clock that evening, and this is the first time he'd ever been to New York. So he wanted to walk down to the office where Hoover was working at, so that he'd know for sure where to go. And I get that, you've got to get your internal GPS so you know where you're going the next day. And he walked down there, and here Hoover was still working in his office. That really impressed him. And he said, well, I'm going to go inside. So he went inside, and Hoover's secretary was still there, and he said, I'd like to speak to Mr. Hoover if he's available. And he said, well, he's in a meeting right now, but I'll let him know you're here. And so she did, and he waited around about 15 minutes or so, and Hoover came out, and they shook hands and met each other, and he said, I'm really impressed that you're here. He said, I see you work farmer's hours. And he says, I'm not going to be done here until about 8 o'clock. So I don't know what you're talking about, farmer's hours, but I got work to do, and I'm not gonna waste time. He says, but you can come back at 6 o'clock in the morning. I'll be here, and we can have our meeting, which he did. A little while later, the American Farm Bureau was having a meeting again in Chicago, and Hoover had asked. There was a real need for corn, and so Howard brought it up at this meeting of other state Farm Bureau presidents and said, here's the thing, there's a real need for corn. How do you propose we go about doing this? And within about a half an hour, those presidents had started to commit to donating rail carloads of corn. And within about 30 minutes, I think it was 35 carloads of corn that they had donated, committed, and within about 2 weeks, they were on their way to Belgium. You give farmers a task, you get them to go, and they get it done, and now we're going to the next thing because they got cows to milk, they got cows to feed, but that was the essence of what was going on at that time. Now you're organized. Now what do you do? That county agent, again, was part extension agent, part USDA employee. They began their education of working by township in people's homes, having those meetings, and really helping the homes, helping the homemakers to learn about preservation of food, hygiene, better ways of cleaning clothes, and all of that, teaching the farmers about obviously better ways of farming and things like that, but better ways of preserving grain, keeping pests out of the grain, which was a huge problem of mice and rats getting into granaries. I have a 1925 Iowa Farm Bureau Messenger hanging on my wall, and it's from July of 1925, and one of the big things in there is they had a state rat catching contest. And the winner, and it was for the person who caught the most rats, and the winner got $75. That was a big deal in 1925, but those were the types of things that they used in order to educate people how to better protect their grain, how to get rid of pests, and things like that. I'm not sure who won. I'm not sure I would want to meet that person, but that was how they educated things. And in this article by Dr. Taylor later, because North Carolina was thinking about having starting a state Farm Bureau program as well, and they asked him if he'd help because of his ties to Iowa, and he said, if you don't have that education part of this, then don't do it. If it's not the Iowa way, don't do it. Because without education, then you're just another place to buy maybe seed, or you become a loosely bound co-op. And he said, and it's not worth it for that. You've got to have the education component to it. Iowa established itself as a true leader in the Farm Bureau movement because of the way they organized, the speed at which they did it, and the effectiveness of how they connected with Iowa State College and Extension and really brought that education piece into it. As that broadened over the years, leadership development became another important part of it. And so they started engaging with young people and doing discussion contests on current issues, things like that. Engaging those people and giving them an opportunity to learn better skills that help themselves personally and professionally, to always be thinking about yourself as a professional. That if you're going to talk about your industry, be prepared to do that. Be prepared to say what it is for you and what farming means to you, things like that. And then and keep moving things forward. And I really believe that the Iowa Farm Bureau has probably done a better job of that than any other state farm bureau in the country. We're one of the few state farm bureaus that still has that county manager approach. Now, we don't have one in every county, but as Craig talked about in my introduction, we have 17 regional managers who each manage 5 or 6 county farm bureaus. They act as that county manager that we had years ago. And the Iowa Farm Bureau developed that model back in 1946. They were the first state farm bureau to do that. And we've stayed committed to that. And it's a difficult thing to do because that's a lot of employees. I mean, it's a large commitment. But that's a commitment that we have to our members and to the farming communities. And when people talk to me about what is Farm Bureau and what do you do and all of this, and there's so many things that we are involved in on those lines, but I really get it down to this one thing. When I retire at the end of the day, what I'm going to be the most proud of is that I had a hand in creating community assets. That through those county farm bureaus, we took what would be your average farmer who doesn't talk very much. They wouldn't say boo in front of 2 people, let alone 20, or a massive audience like this today. And help them become comfortable talking about their industry, talking about what farming means to them, and being a representative of what I think is one of the most noble pursuits and professional pursuits that you can go down to, in today, is to be a farmer. And they take that leadership and they leave Farm Bureau and they do other things. They go to other organizations, or they get on a school board, or they run for the legislature or county supervisor. A lot of those people have those strong ties to Farm Bureau, and I'm very proud of being a part of that. That's what I will hang my hat on at the end of the day. And I think that, I know in Iowa we've not lost that passion. We have not lost that patriotic spirit that when we need to engage our members and farmers on specific issues that really are going to affect them, they engage, they stand up, and they do exactly what's best, for them in that industry. So I guess with that, I've kind of taken you through a whirlwind history thing of Farm Bureau and why it's important, and above all, why it matters to me, why I've committed almost 25 years of my life to helping with this.